Hi, this is the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. There's a historian that I like a whole lot. History was my minor in college, and I've never lost my love for history. You can go on, right? There's just an infinite number of time periods and people and events that you can cover. So Rodney Stark is the author that I really appreciate. He's written a couple of previous books. One was called The Rise of Christianity, and the other was called Cities of God. And that one is how the Christians took over Rome at the beginning of the Christian era. What a wonderful job they did. So I would say Stark is the kind of guy who looks at the original sources. He doesn't take what people have told him. He thinks a lot of what we're hearing today, as far as history goes, is not what really happened. He is the distinguished professor of social sciences at Baylor. He's had 30 books on history and sociology of religion, especially the rise of Christianity, cities of God, for the glory of God, discovering God, the victory of reason. That's a good one, too. So that's Rodney Stark. So he's got one book here called God's Battalions, and he subtitles it, which gives it away, The Case for the Crusades. I mean, we're hearing today, aren't we? What was wrong with the Crusades, and that it's been kind of twisted to make it sound like the Crusades were a bunch of bloodthirsty people who attacked peaceful Muslims. And it's really thought-provoking, I think. He said what he does in the book, basically, is he reviews the history of 7 major crusades. We always think of the one major crusade, but this goes from 1095 to 1291 A.D., and his overall point is that the Crusades were not an offensive war by Christians. They were precipitated by all sorts of Islamic provocations, centuries of attempts to colonize the West by Islamic forces, and sudden attacks on Christian pilgrims in some of their holy places. And he said, the Crusades were initiated by a plea from the Pope. But what Stark is trying to argue is that didn't have anything to do with this, some kind of elaborate design of the Christian world to get all the Muslims and convert them all by force of arms. So it's an interesting view, very different from what we're hearing today. That's what intrigued me about this. So I've done a podcast on it about the so-called Christian Dark Ages and how wonderful the Muslim culture was back then. And Stark sets that straight. And I did a podcast on chapter 4 that talked about what happened to these pilgrims that would go to some of the holy sites, Christian pilgrims, and the persecutions that they encountered. Well, I'd like to do chapter 1. So I've done this out of order, and I feel kind of bad now because this is taking history and jumbling it. But I wanted to do the very first chapter, which talks about the invaders, the Muslims that came into lands that had been Christian. So he starts off, he said, in his farewell address, Muhammad is said to have said this to his followers: "I was ordered to fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah." And Stark says that's consistent with the Quran. If you look in Quran 9:5, "Slay the idolaters wherever you find them, and take them captive, and besiege them, and prepare for them each ambush." And so in that spirit, he says, Muhammad's heirs set out to conquer the world. So background is in 570, that's when Muhammad was born. Christendom was all over, from the Middle East, North Africa, embraced a lot of Europe. He's got a map here, and you can see it. It's kind of the same size as the Roman Empire. But only 80 years after Muhammad's death, that was 632, a new Muslim empire had displaced Christians. If you look at that map and see what changed, the Christians are gone from most of the Middle East. They're gone from North Africa, Cyprus, most of Spain. In another century, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Crete, and southern Italy also came under Muslim rule. So Stark asks, how did this happen? How were the conquered societies ruled? What happened to the millions of Christians and Jews? So let's go through this. It's a quick history, and I'm going to shorten it even more than he shortens it, because I don't want this necessarily to be a history podcast, although I think it's interesting as well. So I said Muhammad managed to unite the desert Bedouin tribes into an Arab state. And so that kind of got things going here. It says raids by Muhammad's forces into Syria and Persia began while he was still alive. Muhammad's life, still around. And there were serious efforts after his death. Now, he says there are a lot of historians today that give just material, secular explanations for the earlier conquests, like, well, economic necessities. There was a population explosion, and they had to invade and conquer other areas to take care of their populations. But Stark contrasts that. He says, no, there was no population explosion. That was invented by authors later. He says the truth is actually quite contrary. Muslim invasions were accomplished by small, well-led and well-organized Arab armies. So he says, well, why did the Arabs attack their neighbors? Well, they had the power to do so. It was a tough time for Byzantium and Persia. They were exhausted. They'd been fighting each other. They had all sorts of bloody defeats. And now you have a unified state among the Arabs, not just little individual areas, but unified. And they could do military campaigns rather than just the hit-and-run raids that they'd done for centuries. But he said the most important reason of all that these Arabs exploded out of their area was they were committed to the spread of Islam. And so Muslims were fighting for their religion. So he says, let's take a look at their conquests before the First Crusade. So I will go quickly over this, although he gives you a lot of good information. So the first place that they attacked and overran was Syria. That was part of the Byzantine Empire. It had a lot of attractions. It was close and it was familiar to them. And you had a Muslim force enter Syria in 633. And they didn't even really bump into any Byzantine forces. Remember, the point Stark is going to make is Byzantium and Persia were exhausted, and so there wasn't a lot of opposition. So pretty soon, a Muslim caliph established Damascus in Syria as the capital of that empire. And he points out, by the way, caliph means successor, and if a person has the title of caliph, it means successor to Muhammad. And then other Arab forces moved against the Persian area of Mesopotamia. Today it's called Iraq. And so, same thing, the Persians were not that strong there, and they had an overwhelming defeat at the hands of the Arabs in 636. And Persia got pacified at that point, and one of the caliphs moved the capital of the Muslim Empire from Damascus to a new city that he built on the Tigris. Its official name was Medina al-Salam, but everyone called it Baghdad, which means gift of God. So it's interesting to hear the rise of some of these cities and when they came about. Well, what about the Holy Land? Well, the Palestine was administered by Greek Christians, but the population there was mostly Jewish. And said many of the Muslim victories over the Byzantines made the Jews think the Messiah was about to appear, and many of the Jews welcomed invading Muslim sources. So Muslim units entered Palestine in 636. There was a siege, and Jerusalem surrendered in 638. What about Egypt? Well, Egypt was also part of the Byzantine Empire as a province, and so the Greek forces of the Byzantine Empire had been shaken and bloodied by their fighting with the Persians. So about 640, a bunch of Muslim troops came in and established themselves in Egypt, in North Africa. That northern coast had been under Byzantine rule, but again, it was a weakened Byzantine Empire. So about 40,000 members of the Muslim army swept over the coastal cities, took Carthage in 698. And now after 700, Spain was in their sight. And so in 711, an army of about 7,000 to 10,000 Muslims from Morocco crossed the Mediterranean, landed on the coast of Spain. And that's pretty amazing, isn't it, that they were able to do that? And I think it's interesting. They landed right by a mountain that jutted out to the sea, and later that mountain was named after the Muslim commander. His name was Tariq ibn Ziyad, and it was known as the Rock of Tariq. And then it became, as people kind of jumbled the name up, it became Gibraltar. Jabal Tariq was the name, but it became Gibraltar. So they had a 7-year campaign then that brought the rest of what they called Spain al-Andalus under their control, except a little part in the north. The Christians could never get ousted. And so this population that was fighting the Muslims called them Moors because they came from Morocco and the name stuck. So if you ever hear that phrase, the Moors. They're talking about the Muslim invaders. Sicily and southern Italy in the 800s fell. So the question is, at this point, after you look at the map and say, wow, they did so well, how'd they triumph so quickly and so easily? It says many historians that don't know much about military art have found this inexplicable. How could a bunch of desert barbarians roll over these civilized armies? But he said the first thing to recognize is that the more civilized empires, they didn't possess any superior military hardware. Everybody used swords and lances and axes and bows. Everybody had a shield. But it said the Persians and the Byzantiums recruited from a lot of foreigners who were there mostly for pay, so they didn't really have much loyalty. And many of the rank and file actually in the Byzantine and Persian forces were Arabs. And a lot of those deserted to the Muslim side. And he said those professional armies, they call them, of Persia and Byzantium, they were not better trained. They were fortress troops. All they were good for was static defense of strong points. And they had a chronic shortage of these troops, so they couldn't maintain a good network of garrisons to prevent an enemy from mounting surprise attacks. And it says if you look at the background, the desert Arabs devoted themselves to arms from an early age. And when they went into battle, they were close-knit. They were from the same tribe. They fought alongside their relatives and lifelong friends. They were brave. They were aggressive. And he says maybe the most important advantage the Muslims had, they all traveled by camel. Even the cavalry rode from place to place on camels, leading their horses. And so you had what he calls kind of the equivalent of a mechanized force. They could outpace the Persians and the Byzantine armies that were having to go by foot. So this mobility, this superior mobility, allowed them to find and attack weakly held places and avoid the main Persian and Byzantine forces till they had them at a disadvantage. So he said actually the Arabs had a huge advantage because they had small armies. They said they usually had 10,000 or fewer. And he said sometimes they would campaign with just 2,000 to 4,000. And he said yet they had successes against these larger imperial forces. He said it's the old story. Small, well-led, aggressive forces up against lumbering enemy hosts. He said, think about how often in ancient history tiny Greek armies would slash and smash immense Persian forces. So they're often able because with their small numbers, they had greater mobility and they could move around on the battlefield and attack an enemy force with more ability in one area and destroy it before reinforcements showed up. And of course, they were very well led. He said not just by tribal leaders, but they had officers that were selected from the ruling elite. And he said finally, promotion and appointment of officers in the early Muslim armies was based on merit, right? So how'd you get ahead in the Muslim armies? If you're good. But the Byzantine and Persian commanders were often unqualified. The only thing they had going for them was their bloodline. Oh, my uncle is so-and-so. My grandfather was so-and-so, so I get to lead this army. Well, you can imagine what happened there. Then the last part of the section here, which I think is important, he says, okay, so what was it like for the people who had been taken over, right? So they said one of the things that happened pretty early was central control broke down, and many provinces became pretty much independent Muslim states. Now, they would recognize the caliph as the chief person, but they would allow him no power in their dominion. So when the West began its counterattacks, the Muslim opposition was limited to troops that were right there. They didn't get reinforcements from other Muslim states. So they kind of like the Greeks, you know how the Greeks were, the city-state was so important. So he said in the beginning, the conquering Arabs were a small elite, and they ruled over a large population of non-Muslims. And actually, many of those remained unconverted for centuries. And so it said the relations with the subject people was pretty much limited to imposing restrictions on certain activities and collecting a whole bunch of taxes. So what was it like if you were a conquered subject? Well, I like what Stark is saying. He said a great deal of nonsense has been written about Muslim tolerance. No, well, that's what we hear today. Is that the case? He says That was shown to be in contrast to Christian brutality against Jews and heretics. That Islam showed remarkable tolerance for conquered people, treated them with respect, allowed them to pursue their faiths without interference. Well, Stark says this claim probably began with Voltaire, Gibbon, and other 18th century writers who used it to show the Catholic Church in the worst possible light. So Stark's claim is that the truth of life under Muslim rule is a lot different than that. He said, no, it's true. The Quran forbids forced conversions. But he says, think about it, the subject peoples, yes, they were free to choose conversion. Well, what was the alternative? Death or enslavement? That was the usual choice presented to pagans. And it said often the Jews and Christians were faced with that option or with one only slightly less extreme. So he said, in principle, people of the book, that's what the Muslims called Jews and Christians, they were supposed to be tolerated and permitted to follow their faith, but only under quite repressive conditions. Death was the fate of anyone who converted to either faith, nor could any new churches or synagogues be built. And what were some other restrictions? Well, Jews and Christians were prohibited from praying or reading their scriptures aloud, even in their homes and even in churches or synagogues, lest a Muslim accidentally hear them. Now, there's a historian he says is excellent, Marshall Hodgson. He pointed out from the very earliest times, Muslim authorities went to great lengths to humiliate and punish what they called dhimmis. Those were Jews and Christians who refused to convert to Islam. They were supposed to be made to feel inferior. They put laws on them, like they couldn't ride horses. At the most, they could ride a mule. They had to wear certain marks of their religion on their costume when they were among Muslims. In some places, non-Muslims were prohibited from wearing clothing that was similar to Muslims. They were severely taxed compared to Muslims. They said, so that's the normal circumstance, but conditions were often far worse than that. In 705, the Muslims who had conquered all of Armenia assembled the Christian nobles in a church and burned them to death. Said there were similar episodes. There were slaughters of Christians. The first Muslim massacre of Jews occurred in Medina when Muhammad had all the local adult Jewish males, something like 700, beheaded after forcing them to dig their own graves. It says massacres of Christians and Jews became increasingly common as time went on. And he gives an example. In the 11th century, there were many mass killings of Jews. In one area called Morocco, something like 6,000 were killed between 1032 and 1033, and at least that many murdered during two outbursts in Granada. In 1570, Muslim invaders murdered tens of thousands of Christian civilians in Cyprus. Now, I like what he says here. He said, I'm not saying that the Muslims were more brutal or less tolerant than were Christians or Jews. He said, this is a brutal and intolerant age. But he said it is wrong to say that the Muslims were enlightened supporters of multiculturalism. He said that's ignorant at best. Now, the last part of the section here talks about how few people were converted. He said what has been regarded as Muslim culture and said to be superior to that of Christian Europe was in fact the Judeo-Christian Greek culture that the Muslims assimilated. So in other words, what we think of as Muslim advances, and I've covered that already, it was actually coming out of the local people, the Jews and the Christians and the Greeks. So toward the end there, he's quoting a British historian who says this: the popes, like most Christians, believed war against the Muslims to be justified partly because the latter had usurped by force lands which once belonged to Christians, and partly because they abused the Christians over whom they ruled, and such Christian lands as they could raid for slaves, plunder, and the joys of destruction. So at the end of the chapter, Stark says this was the spark, right? This was the reason the Christians did what they did with the Crusades, that the Christian attacks on the Muslim lands were actually a defensive war, according to Stark, reacting to the offensive war that the Muslims had done against the Christians all through that area. So, interesting book. It's not that long, easy to read. You can tell from what I've said. If you find history fascinating, this gives you at least a different view from what we're hearing in a lot of modern culture today. So it's called God's Battalions. Well, thanks for being part of this podcast today.